Lisa, how important is it to use gluten-free personal care products such as soap, shampoo, and sunscreen? Yeah.
I think that depends on who you ask. The people in the celiac world say that gluten is a pretty big molecule and that it probably shouldn't pass through the skin. I'd say if you can avoid it, you should, and you can. It's not that hard to do. So we always avoided it. As I say, the celiac people don't seem to think it's a big problem.
I have a whole series of questions which reflects the fact that we haven't been able to tell you everything at once this morning. So you're asking questions that have gone way beyond some of the content of these talks. Is Martha Herbert back yet? Martha? She's on her way? Fine. Okay, well, I'll do a few that are for her too, and she's got plenty to do when she gets here. How effective are traditional allergy skin tests versus elimination and restricting exposure to potential irritants, especially given the effects of synergies of chemicals? Along with that, wouldn't you recommend an IgG antibody test prior to any diet? My child tested high for gliadomorphin in Keflins, but no casomorphins. He's now following a gluten-free diet. We were unsuccessful with the gluten and casein. He craves milk. Okay. There's two kinds of food sensitivities in autism. There's a metabolic intolerance to peptides that come from certain protein foods, cereal grains, the gluten foods, and casomorphins, morphine-like acting peptides from casein. And there's the fact that the kids aren't digesting the protein foods, and this leads to pieces of proteins to which allergies can develop. Then there's another problem which has to do with the sugars, the complex sugars that we call polysaccharides or disaccharides. In the human intestinal tract, there's 7 disaccharidase enzymes that do various duties to digest this big family of complex sugars that we ingest when we eat fruits and vegetables and grains and those kinds of foods. So far, we've been able to test 4 of those families of disaccharidases, and there's subsets of autistic kids that have deficiencies in all 4 that have been tested, and there's 7, so we're just wondering if maybe they have problems with all 7 of them. So if you do allergy tests like IgG tests or skin sensitivity tests, you will probably pick up the immunologic component that's there, that intolerance, but you may very well miss the metabolic component. For example, the peptides that get in and cause problems with enzyme function that we see in autism. Certainly, food allergy tests can be beneficial, especially if you're going to rotate into another family of foods. And in the Dan manual, we discuss doing food allergy testing, and it can steer you away from problems. But it isn't completely foolproof in terms of pointing you towards foods that are going to be acceptable or towards identifying foods to which you would have problems. So that dispenses with a couple of those. And the fact that you have a craving for milk when you have removed casein from the diet suggests 2 things. One, those casomorphins are morphine-like peptides in their action in the body and in the brain, and when we remove these from a child, there's a period of 10 days or 2 weeks where there's a strong craving. Now, if the craving for casein and milk continues beyond that period, it's also suggestive that there's a little bit of casein getting in there, and the child is still getting the signal from the casomorphins that give me more, give me more. And there's a lot of foods that aren't labeled properly or not labeled completely, and you could still have casein present in those foods.
Yeah, Pam Farrow. Our child has been on GFCF diet for 2 years with minor infractions and more recently the SCD with improvements. However, we seem to hit plateaus. How have you introduced steps or enhancements to overcome plateaus?
How long did they say the child was on the diet for?
6 months.
Yeah, I think that the gastrointestinal system takes at least a year from, we've been doing the diet for a couple of years in our practice, and although we see plateaus, you have to continue the diet well past a year. My son's been on the diet for 3 years, and we're still seeing improvements in terms of his cognitive abilities and his language that were nowhere near what he was on gluten-free. So although one of the things that I didn't touch upon is that although the specific carbohydrate diet will heal the intestine, it does not treat things like parasites or Clostridia. So if your child is on the specific carbohydrate diet and is still experiencing bowel problems, or their progress isn't exactly what you would expect, then I would highly recommend some testing, including a comprehensive digestive stool analysis, which can sort of find those problems for us. There are plenty of kids with really bad bacteria that you can be on the specific carbohydrate diet for 10 years and it's not going to treat them. Although we use a lot less medicine in our practice now since this diet, we still do use medicine to treat those, the bacteria and the parasites.
Usually we have to ask the parents at the podium to limit their questions to be brief. So now I'm going to ask the panelists. That was very good, but all the panelists should be quick so we can get through a few of these. Okay, John.
Out of the 1,000 recovered children, what percent are girls? Are any of these considered profound priorities? We don't have the statistics on that yet. But an observation, we know that in the general autistic population we expect to find 4 to 5 boys to every 1 girl. I've noticed when we've had the children come up on the podium and be interviewed, and we've had dozens of them now, I'm seeing proportionately fewer girls. So I suspect that it is harder to recover the girls than the boys, but we do have some recovered girls.
And this is a question for all the panelists. A number of people have written in, when at all, when can you come off these diets? Is there ever a time where these kids can come off the diets? What's your opinion on that?
As I said during the discussion, is that I think that the entire family, number one, should be on the specific carbohydrate diet, because the more moms I test and the more dads I test, there are lots of issues in the gastrointestinal system. Moms with yeast and parasites, and dads with cardiac problems. So once you start doing a diet like the specific carbohydrate diet, for most of the people that I talk with, you will not let your kids eat other foods. The first 3 months, I have to admit, you feel like maybe you're a failure, because it is very difficult for most families. I say that the diet is simple, but it's not easy. It takes a good 3 months to get on your feet, but after that, and when the family's eating well, I don't have families really clamoring to get back to saying, when can we have French fries? I don't see that, but in 2 cases that both children have been on the specific carbohydrate diet for more than a year, in 2 cases we've introduced wheat and have not seen a problem. I don't recommend that, and I really hate to say it. But so I think that what's helping in the specific carbohydrate diet is actually we're just not putting Band-Aids, we're just not walking around putting out the fire, we're actually healing the gut with this diet. So I do believe that it'll be possible to eat food or the other food or what's considered the American diet, but I wouldn't recommend it.
I just want to point out that Elaine used to say that you should wait to reintroduce regular food, you should wait a year past the date of the last symptom.
Okay, Martha, you want to pick one of those and go to it?
I'm going to combine 2 of them since I got about 17 of them. I have a question of, is there evidence of in MRI, PET scans that problems exist and that later on they're better from after treatment? And I have a number of people who said that they banked their baby's cord blood and could we use it in studies. And I'm going to combine those to say that we're very much interested. My research program right now is based on trying to find brain biomarkers that are sensitive to treatment interventions, because I think it would be really critical to validate what we're doing, to be able to say that when we're treating the gut and we're treating inflammation, we can document in an objective fashion and not just by behavior questionnaires an improved function in the brain. I think that's really important. Now, people have been doing that with SPECT scans showing improved perfusion. What I've been working on more, what I'm moving into is an MEG and EEG electrophysiology program studying really early processing, which I think is going to be closest to the neurochemical changes that are causing the problems and that we can affect by treatment. I also think that a critical frontier, as I already said, is to measure chemistry, and we're putting together several grants to collect cord blood and even amniotic fluid from mothers at risk, and anybody, and I think what I ought to do is set up some kind of a place that people could at least sign up for this, trying to set up a biomarker development program so that we can have, I think it's really interesting that in the studies studying baby SIBs at risk for autism, people with an older sibling with documented autism who have a younger kid, the kid, you want to study them coming up from birth. The studies to date have been purely behavioral, not one drop of blood, not one drop of urine. I mean, this is a biological disorder, and not even EEG, and the MRI we tried, but it was very hard. Of the least sensitive measure is what we tried. So, I think it's really, my opinion is that with all due respect to my colleagues in research who have many, many gifts and strengths, one of the things that they don't really know very much about is biochemistry. And it's just a lost art. I mean, people seem to think that genetics would substitute for it. So I really think that the kinds of intelligence of the people we have here in the doctors group could provide a great service by helping people to figure out where the hell to start to measure this stuff in their research program, so we could collect enough data to see what does change in kids who get well, so what does change in kids as they're getting sick, and hopefully figure out where to get in there and fix it sooner. So any kind of samples that we can collect and the before, middle, and after samples will be extremely helpful, and I'm working on setting up a more structured way of having this happen. Yeah.
Go ahead.
There's much talk last night and this morning about chemicals. Do chelators pull chemicals out as well as toxic minerals? Is impaired detoxification always a marker for heavy metal toxics in the system, etc.? Please comment. The body has multiple detox pathways, especially for chemicals. We call them xenobiotics, outside biological acting chemicals that get in and cause trouble. These also involve the same processes for getting rid of heavy elements. So glutathione, for example, has to do triple duty, actually. It has to look out for and try and counteract oxidant stress. It has to detoxify from the cell, for example, taking mercury out of the cell. And glutathione also has to do work in getting rid of toxic chemicals from the environment. When we bolster glutathione levels, or when we do chelation, we not only help one process, but we help the other process, and they're interrelated. It's quite likely that an individual who has heavy metal toxicity also has xenobiotic chemical toxicity, even though we're not measuring it. And when we help one, we help the other.
Lisa, Judy, Pam, tell us more about cultured veggies, cultured vegetables, and their probiotic benefit.
Culturing food is really, really an old thing. I mean, I don't know how far back it goes, but when food is cultured, it's usually vegetables, and sometimes it's coconut. It serves the same purpose that the yogurt does in the SED, which is it's really, really good for putting probiotics, putting the good bugs back into your body. And if you go to the Body Ecology website, which is linked to on the Andy website, you can see recipes. If you just Google it, you can get how to culture. Usually it's cabbage and things like that. And there's even a little video on how to make the coconut kefir. Kefir is a fermented drink that's often made out of milk, but this is made out of these little young green coconuts, which you can find they look like little huts, but it takes a lot of coconuts and a lot of work to get the water out. So you can also buy the water already extracted. And it's a very simple process of putting it in a jar and following the directions, and it ferments and it gets kind of fizzy. And you just give it to the kids, usually starting with like a teaspoon at a time and build up. And you can mix it with drinks and things like that. And it seems to be very good for probiotic growth.
We have a question about phenols. Can you talk about phenols and autism? Anyone?
How about John?
John?
What was this?
Phenols and autism.
Most phenols are bad. Some phenols are good. The amino acid tyrosine, for example, has a phenolic structure. The problem with phenols is they use some of the same detox pathways that we have problems with in autism, sulfation and methylation. So when we load our body with phenols, we are adding to the load, to the stress that injured chemistry has to cope with. So lowering phenol intake is beneficial generally, yes. Grapes, cheeses, bananas, those kinds of foods are yeah. What? Milk? Chocolate? Oh yeah, chocolate has phenolics in it too, yes.
You have to leave the stage now if you're saying chocolate's bad.
Can I just say something?
Yes.
Right before Elaine Gottschalk passed away, I'd asked her that if she felt that if the gastrointestinal system was healed, how would that impact detoxification? The doctor that she had met, Dr. Sidney Haas, had supposedly, and I haven't been able to find any information, chelated some gentlemen that were exposed to lead with diet only. So she really felt that once you heal the gastrointestinal system, it would take the pressure off the liver, and maybe some of these children could actually chelate themselves, that you get the body working to kick out this, you heal the gut.
Martha, you have a good question?
Yeah. There are two questions. One of them is my child has spike and waves on EEG, but not epilepsy. Should I treat with drugs? And another one is, well, the inflammatory markers are within normal range, but they're not quite right. What should I do? One of the big problems that we're dealing with in chronic diseases like autism and many other environmental diseases is that the reference range, the cutoff that we have used in the labs is based on an idea that the disease is a separate entity from everything else. And what we're talking about is a gradual decline and differences in function. So my sense is if you have a suspicion that something is off, you should support the resiliency of the system with nutrients and take away both the toxins and the environmental triggers that are ongoing, such as foods that would provoke allergic or other sensitivity reactions. In order to take the stress off the system, you don't have to either do drugs or do nothing. There's a lot of other ways of thinking about it, and start thinking of these things as a continuum of risk. What we define as the cutoff into disease is somewhat arbitrary because you're not well, boom, you're sick. There's a process, and we want to treat along that process and not just at the end point.
Why so many pockets of autism cited in, say, New Jersey and Oregon? Another question. EPA inventory tracks, industry releases. What about pollution sources, automobiles, et cetera, high traffic areas? The total toxic load is very important to many of these autistic children. They're having difficulty detoxifying, and various pathways, chemical pathways for detoxifying things are shared by different pollutants, different toxicants. So the fact that we have a lot of toxic substances that we're trying to contend with affects the detoxification of a different substance, since there's shared pathways. New Jersey is notorious for chemical plants. Brick Township, I guess, is there, and waste dumps and things like that. So it's a polluted area. The question about Oregon is one I asked Steve Edelson about 3 years ago, because it is a hotbed of autism. And I sent him an article from a journal showing that the seabed, the sediments in the harbors and the seabeds were polluted with various things, including mercury. And one speculation is that it comes from, historically, from volcanoes, Mount St. Helens and things like that erupting. The place looks like a Garden of Eden, but hidden under the surface are environmental toxicants.
I just had a realization. Do you realize a world-renowned pediatric neurologist is sitting at the same table with nutrition experts? That's powerful. Wow, that may be a first. Okay, so let's see, Lisa and Pam and also Judy, if you'd like to respond. This is we hear this question a lot. If you have testing done and it doesn't reveal a problem with gluten and casein, do you still recommend a gluten casein-free diet?
I can take that. We had some testing done for my son, and in the meantime took him off wheat. And when we spoke to the doctor, she said, he's fine, he doesn't need to be off wheat or anything. And I said, well, but we're seeing improvement. And she said, well, dear, if you think so. But there really was improvement. I'm not sure that any of the tests are, any kind of tests are 100%, but I've heard from lots of people who've had more than one kind of allergy testing, and they get wildly different results. Probably the best way to tell is to eliminate something, whether you're looking at like an immunological kind of response, an actual true allergy, or just some kind of other intolerance, metabolic or whatever. I don't think you can beat elimination. That's my opinion.
Yeah, that's very true. The tests provide guidelines, but they're not foolproof.
In clinical, in epilepsy, we say you treat the patient, you don't treat the EEG. Sometimes an EEG can be negative. The seizure source can be very deep, and you only detect the outer 5 millimeters or so of the brain from an EEG. So it's a similar thing with, our instruments are only somewhat sensitive, and they can miss things, and we have to use clinical judgment. With regard to diet, there is a diet like the ketogenic diet that's used, that's mainstreamed now. It wasn't always mainstream, so it's interesting to trace what it takes to mainstream something like that. We'd like to see it here too.
That one? No. My son is recovered, is a GFCF, also chemical-free, no artificial colors or preservatives, made a huge difference. He got one lollipop and his behavior plummeted for 2 days. Do you officially advocate no chemicals as part of the diet? Well, yes, if depends on the individual, of course, but many of our children cannot stand artificial flavors, fragrances, colors, and that sort of thing. Again, the detox pathways are too challenged in these individuals and too compromised to handle these substances in many cases.
How would you assess when it's time to switch from a GFCF diet to an SCD diet?
Well,
I know.
Most parents will see an improvement, if not immediate, after regression. But to me, if somebody comes to me and they say, gee, we did really, really well, but we're continuing to have yeast problems, we're continuing to have, bowel problems, and if they've already taken out corn and, and soy, it seems to me a pretty clear indication that they need to take the next step. Would you say that's it?
Well, see, I don't see it as two separate diets. If you do a gluten and casein-free diet and you do it without the junk food, you're on the specific carbohydrate diet. Our goal is, and as Judy says, learn from our mistakes. And when I first opened my practice and started feeding my son gluten and casein-free, I thought I could feed him the garbage American diet, just gluten and casein-free. Great, there were gluten-free brownies, there were gluten-free French fries, which they say now that they're not gluten-free or casein-free, McDonald's French fries. But the goal really for us to teach you today is, and although we're all parents, so we all know the issues of the fear of my child only eats two things. I can tell you I've seen 300 children on the autism spectrum. Every single child child has changed their diet. It's the initial parent fear of my kids only eating 2 things. How are they going to eat fruits and vegetables? I can tell you to think a little bit old-fashioned, the way that our grandmothers raised their kids. When the kids are hungry, they're going to eat. The goal is to get the garbage out of the house. So I think that we have to be careful with the specific carbohydrate diet as well, that does not become a junk food diet. You could go home today and feed your kid 5 pounds of almond flour cookies. And that's not great. The goal for any of these diets is to really do fresh, unprocessed foods. And the added benefit of doing specific carbohydrate diet is you're really pulling out the starches as well. That will help heal the bellies in a lot of these kids. We're seeing miraculous changes in the children.
Super important question here. Thanks to the questioner. Since underlying mechanisms in regressive autism can be adapted with specific forms of sensory input, such as inputs of cerebellar and reticular pathways through the vestibular systems and ocular, motor, and auditory language relays, would you consider sensory integration approaches to treatment worthy of exploration in clinical trials? Well, our philosophy is that we remove the stressors and do the best we can for the biochemistry and immunology prior to or along with behavioral training, ABA, sensory integration, and these other processes. It's not an either or. We're certainly not anti other procedures. What we're trying to, the message we're trying to get across is that there's something gone wrong in the biochemistry. There's something wrong in the ability to detox and handle oxidant stress, and the children will learn much faster and go much farther if you take care of what's organically wrong, along with trying to retrain the brain to integrate the various networks and come out with integrative thought and expressive speech. Thanks for that question.
So I got this question, is there any evidence to suggest that the larger brains fluctuate in size periodically and thus would be linked to the good weeks and bad weeks observed with many of these children? It's hard to measure brain size. You got to get a kid in a, so if they're alive, you have to keep them still in an MRI, which is either very hard or you sedate them and it costs $1,000, and it's not something you do one day and then do it the next day. So I'm not aware of people who have done serial, repeated MRIs during a short interval. I do think that the good hair days, the bad hair days, the good hair hours, the bad hair hours are critical, and they show that this is not just a hardwired steady state condition, and that whatever it is that's making it good or bad, we should look at. I think the best way to do that is just keep very careful track of what your child is exposed to by food and other things during the day. If we were going to use more other measures, you're not going to draw a blood test every day, you're not going to do a urine test every day, you're not going to do an EEG every day, but it would be worth looking into it more. And I've been using this argument as evidence that we need to be looking at metabolism and not just genetics and wiring.
And there are a few cases where we have, and we do have inflammation in the brain. Dr. Herbert presented some of the papers on that. And there are some cases where we have inflammation and swelling of the brain tissue. And this is not, this of course would be a variable thing depending upon what's causing the swelling. But that's not what she normally means by brain size being.
Well, we don't really know. We don't know what's making the brain bigger.
Okay.
I mean, it's bigger in my research mostly in the white matter, but it's beginning to look like it's not the myelin, the kind of myelin sheath that makes the white matter white itself. And some people do suspect that it might be inflammation, but we haven't proved it yet. We know that systemic inflammation, there was this amazing poster at Neurosciences a couple of years ago that a body inflammatory process that would raise this inflammatory marker, TNF-alpha, for a few hours in the liver, raised it up for a month in the brain. So it's like systemic inflammation can have the time scales of how long it hangs around are variable in different parts of the body. And that's one of the reasons I suspect that a gluten-free, casein-free, you have to stay off of these immune irritants for a substantial period of time before you see anything, if indeed it's triggering some kind of a central nervous system immune thing that takes a while to wear off.
Those are stressors that have to be removed before we can reset metabolism to operate the way we want it to. Now, we're starting in this meeting with diet. We will move this afternoon into digestion and gut issues, and from there into nutritional aspects and nutritional treatments. Tomorrow you have a parent session and a science session where there'll be further details, and we get into metabolic manipulations and fancier stuff on Sunday. So some of your questions won't get answered here, but we're going to save some of them for the appropriate speakers as they come along in the meeting.
There's a question here about salmon that people have heard it's good and it's bad, and what kind are the best. And basically, the common knowledge at this point is that sockeye salmon and wild king salmon are the most pure, least amount of mercury, and have the highest content of omega-3 fatty acids. You'll pay about $13 a pound for it, but it's usually much better than the farm-raised salmon, which is loaded with mercury and other pollutants. And how can you tell if a product is really organic? You know, there's charlatans in every aspect of society, and they've infiltrated that field also. But one recommendation I've read is to shop at a reputable store, a Whole Foods or a good reputable store, and speak to the manager and find out exactly where they're getting their produce, and also join a local organic farm. You share a crop, and that's a good way to introduce your children to where you get the food that they're eating, and you take them and you can pick the string beans and the berries, and they learn a little bit about farming, and you pay a lot less for your produce that way, and you know what's going on and into those crops. Here's a pretty common question. It's a little bit of a misconception. Yes, please do.
Just a quick comment on the corn. You may not know this, but farm-raised salmon is fed corn. Now, I ask you, in the history of the planet Earth, did fish ever, on their own, eat corn? Now, corn has omega-6 fatty acids. It doesn't have omega-3. And on top of that, those fish come out, from what I hear, beige, and they have to dye them pink. Yeah. So it's not like it's really a number of steps away from real food, and I just thought you might want to know that.
I would just like to add something with corn. We've seen pretty consistently in our practice that children who smear feces, and parents don't usually like to talk about that, are kids who are getting exposed to corn. You take corn out, they stop smearing feces, you put corn back in, they'll smear feces again. So if your kid's doing it, one of the first things to do is to, in not all the cases, but in most cases, just a handful of Fritos will do it for some children.
Or high fructose corn syrup, which is in just about every piece of processed food there is.
And another bizarre behavior a lot of children exhibit is pica, where they gravitate towards basically food or items that aren't edible. And we've talked about this for years, that we find when we get the nutrients in the kids through changing their diet and healing the gut and getting them to absorb nutrients, they start gravitating towards real food and stop eating batteries and pennies and dirt. So there is a theory that their body is searching for nutrients in those inedible items. But so here's this misconception that I want Pam to clear up. My child has a severe yeast problem. The carbohydrate diet contains many items that yeast thrive on. I am so confused what to feed my child.
And so the specific carbohydrate allows the single sugars that can be absorbed without being broken down. The problem with yeast is when the kids who are missing the enzymes eat a disaccharide or polysaccharide, they don't have the enzymes to break down those bonds. So food comes in as a milk sugar or a table sugar. They come in bonds of sugars stuck together. As a matter of fact, when I showed you that circle of a polysaccharide, all that is sugar molecules bonded together. And what some of the children are missing is those bonds to break down those sugars. So if those undigested carbohydrates hit the large colon, that's when you'll get bacteria to be overfed. The monosaccharides should not do that. Although I will say that early in the diet, especially for kids who are real yeasty, we don't recommend using lots of honey and lots of apples, things, even though they're monosaccharides. That should be done in steps, especially for the real yeasty kids, and especially if they haven't used medicine initially to get down the yeast.
While you cannot do it entirely with diet, you can't do it without diet in many cases. This afternoon we're going to have more information about GI function. Also, Dr. Mary James will be talking to you about herbal remedies and other remedies to keep the yeast down to a dull roar and to keep the population of microorganisms in the gut in a more or less appropriate mix. Also, tomorrow when our exhibitors are here, there are supplements that you can inquire about to help you make the diet work, because there's always the threat in these children of developing some sort of an intestinal dysbiosis.
I think probably, unless anyone has a super powerful question, this will be the last. When is it time, when you've done GFCF and you've done SCD, when is it time, and you haven't seen much of a difference, when do you give up, or what do you do next? And that's one of the things we're going to address tonight in the 2-hour workshop, where Susan Owens is going to explain the low oxalate diet, which is hovering on the horizon there. She's got a lot of data, a lot of research, a lot of time investigating this idea. It's a little premature to present it here today, but we do have reports from parents that it can be helpful. So I would encourage you, if you have, this is a pretty complex subject. Obviously, this has been evolving through the DAN work for about 8-9 years now, and we're giving you the current course of things, but you have to stay with it. And so if you have additional questions, please come to that workshop tonight. We're going to break now for lunch. Lunch is, you can go to the cafe here in the hotel upstairs. They're looking for a big crowd. Or there are a few local restaurants, but we ask that you be back here at 1:30. And thank you very much for a great morning.